Father Elias Whitcomb arrived in St. Agnes on an unusually warm autumn day, a moment of quiet before the storm. His horse-drawn carriage rolled slowly over the gravel road that led into town, the town's modest buildings beginning to take shape against the horizon as the sun dipped low. The small parish of St. Agnes, tucked away in the rolling hills of Missouri, had been struggling in recent years. The old priest had grown ill, and the town had been left in limbo, waiting for guidance from the bishop. Father Elias' arrival was seen as a blessing, a sign of renewal after months of uncertainty. He was a man of mid-years, with a calm demeanor, sharp eyes that held a certain depth, and an air of humility that spoke volumes to the townsfolk. The people saw in him what they desperately wanted: hope. His simple black cassock and the soft resonance of his voice soothed those around him, each word spoken with such confidence that it was impossible not to trust him. He greeted everyone with a kind smile, his presence a balm to the parched hearts of the parishioners. Yet beneath the surface of this serene exterior, something else lingered. For Father Elias, his faith was not simply about salvation. It was about suffering, a suffering that in his mind was essential to salvation itself. His journals, written in a precise hand, revealed this unsettling truth. In the quiet of his chamber, far from prying eyes, he wrote long passages about the purifying nature of pain, the need to cleanse one's soul through the endurance of torment. He spoke of atoning through affliction, a philosophy that, while not overtly wicked on its face, hinted at something far more disturbing when examined in detail. Father Elias believed that the world was corrupt, that only through immense suffering could one truly expunge the sin that resided within. He wasn't simply there to guide, he was there to purge. He saw the townspeople as flawed, as broken vessels that needed to be filled with a purer form of faith, one born not from mercy, but from the most primal form of repentance. His methods were not of the church's teachings, not of the comfort he projected in his public persona, but of something darker, something older and far more brutal. As he sat in the quiet of his room at night, the flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in a way that was unnatural. His fingers, stained with ink, would often hover above the pages of his journals, lost in thought. He scribbled his thoughts down furiously, his words filled with a kind of fervor that bordered on mania. In one passage, he wrote about the cleansing of the soul through physical torment, about subjects who suffered willingly in the name of the Lord to rid themselves of the sins they could not see. His handwriting, so neat and measured during the day, would become frenzied, almost illegible during the darkest hours of the night. But even in his madness, there was a clarity in his purpose. He knew what he was doing. The people of St. Agnes would serve as his instruments, his willing participants in a ritual far more ancient than anything the church had ever condoned. His belief in salvation through suffering would soon take form in ways the town could never imagine. For now, however, the people saw only kindness in him. They saw a shepherd who would guide them through the darkest days ahead. But beneath that guise, Father Elias had already begun his work. The foundations were being laid, and the first seeds of his twisted mission were already planted. Father Elias began his reformation quietly. He walked the streets of St. Agnes with a calm smile and a gentle nod for everyone, but his attention always lingered on those most forgotten: the children without parents, the widows with trembling hands, the drifters who sat too long on church steps. He spoke often of God's mercy, but even more of his tests, of suffering as a gift, a cleansing fire. And though the congregation found his sermons powerful, even comforting, there was something in his voice when he spoke of pain that didn't sit right with the oldest among them. Still, no one questioned the man who prayed harder than the rest, who brought food to the sick, who took the lost boys into the parish to teach them scripture and discipline. That was how Tommy came under his care. Tommy was 10, maybe 11, one of 3 orphans left behind after the fever swept through town 2 years before. He barely spoke, mostly stared at the ground, always with a dirty shirt tucked into threadbare trousers. He lived behind the bakery and slept in the flour shed until Father Elias took him in. To the townspeople, it was a small miracle, a boy once abandoned now cared for by the church. The boy followed Father Elias around like a shadow, helping in the chapel, sweeping leaves from the steps, learning the rhythms of prayer and penance. And for a time, there was peace in that image. A priest and a boy, teacher and student. But in the second week, neighbors began to notice strange flickering lights through the chapel's cellar windows after dark. Once someone heard a low humming noise, rhythmic and hollow, like breath echoing through pipes. Then the boy disappeared for a full day. When he returned, his steps were slower. His hands shook when he reached for communion bread. His eyes, once dull with silence, now seemed peeled open by something unnatural. Too wide, too distant, like they no longer saw what was in front of them. The townsfolk said nothing. After all, the boy was in good hands. That night, the cellar door remained locked from the inside. A thin line of soot marked the bottom of the door. The bell tower rang once, not by schedule, but no one admitted to pulling the rope. The next morning, Tommy's body was found near the back of the altar, laid flat on a wool blanket as though someone had meant to display him before removing the evidence. His shirt was removed, and just above his ribs, seared into the flesh, was a perfect circle with a cross inside it. Not a crucifix, but something older, something geometric, almost scientific. His mouth was slightly open as if caught mid-whisper. His hands were clasped over his chest in forced prayer, but his fingers were blistered and raw. There were no visible wounds, no blood, just that symbol, and a thin red string tied around one of his ankles. Father Elias said the boy had died in his sleep, that his heart must have given out from past illness. He offered to cover the cost of the burial and said he would personally bless the grave. The townspeople, unsure of how to speak their doubts, said nothing. They nodded, murmured prayers, and lowered their eyes. Only one woman, the baker's wife, whispered to her husband that the boy's hands looked like they'd been bound. But she too fell silent after Elias stopped by that evening to offer his condolences with a warm loaf of bread. That night, the cellar door creaked again, and though no one saw Father Elias descend the stairs, they heard the soft scrape of wood and metal shifting underground. The symbol from the boy's body, that unnatural brand, began appearing in Elias's journal alongside phrases like, "First vessel cleansed and pain brings clarity." He did not weep. He wrote slowly and without emotion that Tommy had been chosen, that his silence had been perfect, that others would follow. Jane had always kept to herself, a widow since her husband had succumbed to pneumonia years before, leaving her with little but the silence of her small cottage and the company of her memories. But when Father Elias arrived in St. Agnes, his presence seemed to stir something in the air, something that disturbed the stillness of her life. She'd noticed at first the way the townspeople looked at him with such reverence, the way they spoke of his healing touch, his quiet counsel, his charity. He was a man of God, they said, sent to guide them. Jane, however, felt a tightening in her chest whenever he passed her by, as though the weight of his gaze held something unspoken, something beneath the surface. It wasn't just the town's blind admiration that set Jane on edge. It was the subtle shifts in Father Elias's behavior, the way his voice seemed to change when he spoke of sin, how it dropped into a low, almost reverent whisper, as though he himself carried some knowledge no one else dared to touch. How his gaze would linger too long on the children, especially the ones who didn't speak, the ones who wandered too far into the shadows. At first, she dismissed it, telling herself she was imagining things. But then one evening, as she passed by the chapel on her way home from the market, she saw it. Father Elias was in the garden, standing over a boy, one of the orphans who had been taken under his wing. The boy was kneeling, hands pressed to the earth as Father Elias placed something small and round into the child's palm. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide, face pale. Father Elias smiled at him, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The child's hands trembled as he held the object, and for a brief moment their eyes met across the distance. Jane quickly turned away, feeling her heart race in her chest. There was something wrong with that smile. Something wrong with the way the boy looked, as though he was being asked to carry a burden too heavy for his small frame. The next morning, Jane began her journal, though she kept it hidden beneath the floorboards. She started to take notes, recording every odd behavior, every unexplained absence of the children, every whispered conversation she overheard between Father Elias and the parishioners. The journal became her refuge, a place where her suspicions could take root, far away from the disapproving eyes of the townsfolk. As the weeks passed, she began to see the pattern. The children would disappear for hours, sometimes whole days, only to return pale and withdrawn. When she asked the parents, they were quick to dismiss her concerns. "Father Elias is a man of the Lord," they'd say. "He's doing good work for the community." But Jane knew better. She saw the strange lights flicker beneath the chapel's cellar windows at night, the way Father Elias would disappear into the church late in the evening, only to emerge hours later, his face grim, his hands stained with something Jane couldn't quite place. And then there were the whispers. Always just out of reach, always too soft to hear clearly. The tension in the air grew heavier, and the town seemed to fall into a quiet lull, as if lulled by Father Elias's calm and patient demeanor. The more Jane watched, the more the rituals began to take shape in her mind. The children, the unmarked graves, the strange symbols etched into the church's walls. It was all connected, tied together by a dark thread that ran deeper than anyone cared to look. But Jane couldn't stop. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something terrible. That Father Elias was not the savior they thought him to be, but something far darker. The weight of her suspicions pressed in on her, and the journal became her only ally, the only place where she could still breathe. But even as she filled the pages with her observations, she knew it would only be a matter of time before someone or something found out what she was doing. Father Elias was too careful, too controlled. And the townspeople were too blind to see what was unfolding right in front of them. Jane's investigation, she knew, was only a breath away from disaster. And as she closed her journal that night, the final page untouched, she couldn't help but wonder if she was already too late. Jane had never intended to venture behind the parish. It was a place where the townspeople went only in reverence, where the church's shadow stretched long across the earth, and where few would dare trespass without cause. But her investigation had led her there, driven by an overwhelming need to understand what was happening in the shadows, beneath the facade of Father Elias' piety. There, beyond the garden and the thick stone walls, she found something that shook her to the core. It was the graveyard, hidden from the view of the parish, tucked away at the edge of the property. No one had spoken of it, no one had mentioned the rows of earth that lay undisturbed, or so it seemed, until Jane had taken it upon herself to investigate. She had noticed the absence of a few children, the strange hush that fell over the older parishioners when their names were mentioned. She had to know, even if it cost her sanity. The air around the graveyard was heavy with the scent of damp earth. As Jane stepped closer, she felt the weight of the silence pressing against her, and the ground beneath her seemed to pulse with a slow, unnatural rhythm. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she brushed away the overgrown weeds and dried grass, revealing the edges of the first unmarked grave. The earth was freshly disturbed, as if it had been hastily dug and then hastily covered again. The soil was still loose in places, the edges jagged, as though the bodies had been buried in a rush. With a creeping sense of dread, she moved along the row of graves, her fingers brushing against the cool stone of a marker that didn't belong. No name, no date, just a smooth, blank surface. Her heart hammered in her chest as she uncovered another, and then another, each one marked only by the disturbed earth, no sign of who had been laid to rest beneath it. There were 22 in total. The number was too precise to be a coincidence, and yet there was no explanation. No one had ever spoken of these graves. Father Elias had been right. No one had ever mentioned them, and no one ever would. When Jane finally turned to leave, she found Father Elias standing at the edge of the graveyard, watching her, his face unreadable. His presence was a heavy weight, suffocating her with its intensity. His eyes glimmered not with the light of faith, but with something darker, something older. His lips parted slowly, and he spoke in a voice that was as calm as ever, though there was a certain finality in his words. "These are the remains of unfortunate souls," he said softly. "Those whose deaths might have caused scandal. They were buried in secret to preserve the dignity of the parish." But Jane felt a chill slide down her spine, a deep, growing sense that she was being lied to. She looked down at the graves again, the pattern too deliberate, too organized to be simply a coincidence. The earth had been shaped into a circle, each grave aligned in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. It was as though the bodies had been arranged with intent, each one placed according to some hidden design, as if part of a ritual, not just a burial. Father Elias watched her for a moment, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, as if sensing her unease, he added, "It is the way of things, Jane. Some must be hidden to protect the greater good." The words lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, leaving Jane with a feeling she couldn't shake. The greater good. What could that mean? What kind of greater good would demand such secrecy? Why were these lives erased so thoroughly? As she walked away, the sense of dread gnawed at her. The graves, the odd arrangement, the hollow finality of Father Elias's words. They all fit into a growing, unbearable truth. She had seen enough. She had uncovered too much. And yet, despite the horror swirling in her chest, she couldn't stop herself from digging deeper. Something in the soil, in the pattern, was calling her. She couldn't ignore it. There was something far darker at work in St. Agnes than Father Elias was letting on. Something far more twisted, more methodical, and more terrifying than she ever imagined. And she was the only one who could see it. But for how much longer? Jane had begun to feel the weight of something far darker than she had ever anticipated. The graves were only the beginning. Behind Father Elias's gentle facade, there was a methodical cruelty that no one in St. Agnes could see, and now she was the only one who had the courage, or the madness, to confront it. But it was not just the graves that had troubled her. It was the missing pieces, the whispers she heard in passing, the cryptic words of the townsfolk. The turning point came when she discovered the diary of a young woman named Rebecca. It was hidden in the back of a dusty drawer in the church's old library, a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Jane had been looking for anything that might explain the strange rituals she had uncovered, and she knew that Rebecca had once been a prominent figure in the parish before she had mysteriously disappeared. As she flipped through the pages, the handwriting seemed almost desperate, the words scrawled hastily as if Rebecca had been trying to tell someone, anyone, what had happened to her. The diary began innocuously enough, describing Rebecca's sudden illness, her increasing weakness, and how Father Elias had come to her bedside one evening. He had offered her solace, a promise of healing that only he could provide. At first, Rebecca had been skeptical, but as Father Elias spoke to her in that soft, reassuring voice, she had begun to believe him. She trusted him. But as Jane continued reading, the tone of the diary grew darker. Rebecca had written about the first night she had spent in the parish under Father Elias's care. He had told her that in order to be healed, she would have to undergo a cleansing, not of the body but of the soul. It was a ritual, he had explained, one that would rid her of the sins that had corrupted her and left her vulnerable to illness. At first, Rebecca had agreed, seeing it as a chance for redemption. She believed, as so many did, that Father Elias was a man of God, and she had trusted him completely. But what followed was nothing like the divine healing she had expected. Instead, Rebecca was subjected to a slow, torturous process, one that wore down both her body and mind. Father Elias had placed her in a small, windowless room beneath the church, where she was isolated from the world. There, he subjected her to daily purification rituals. Each day, he would perform a different cleansing, forcing her to drink foul-tasting concoctions that burned her throat and caused her to vomit uncontrollably. He had bound her wrists to the bedposts, allowing her no freedom, forcing her to remain still while he prayed over her in a language she didn't understand. The diary detailed how Father Elias would make her repeat lines over and over. "I am unclean. I am impure. I must suffer to be saved." Each time she spoke these words, he would strike her, telling her that it was the only way to cleanse herself. Rebecca's body grew frail, her skin pale and taut from dehydration and lack of proper nourishment. But it wasn't just the physical suffering that wore her down. It was the slow erosion of her mind, the constant whisper of Father Elias's voice, telling her that only through suffering could she truly be pure. She had written about how she began to lose touch with reality, her thoughts consumed by guilt and fear, believing that every breath she took was another sin to be purged. Father Elias's atonement was not just physical, it was psychological. He had broken her piece by piece, until there was nothing left of Rebecca but a hollow shell, a woman who had given herself to a cause that wasn't hers. And the worst part, the most horrifying realization for Jane, was that Rebecca had thought it was all for her own salvation. She had believed that death was the only escape from the torment. As Jane closed the diary, a wave of revulsion swept over her. She felt sick to her stomach, the weight of what she had just read pressing down on her chest. Father Elias wasn't just using his influence to heal the sick or guide the troubled. He was performing a twisted ritual of suffering, one that was designed to break the spirit, to erase the individual, and to rebuild them as something else entirely. A servant to his warped sense of redemption. And what had happened to Rebecca was not an isolated incident. Jane understood now. The children, the orphans, the sick. They were all being subjected to the same horrors. Father Elias was cleansing them, purging them of what he saw as their sins, but in reality he was destroying them, body and soul. Jane's blood ran cold. She was in far too deep, and the truth she had uncovered was far worse than she had ever imagined. Father Elias wasn't the man of faith the town believed him to be. He was something much darker, and the longer she stayed, the more entangled she would become in his web. But she couldn't turn back now, not after seeing what he had done to Rebecca. Not after realizing that he had likely done it to many others before her. She had to stop him. But how? Jane's investigation into Father Elias had become a silent war, one fought in shadows and whispers. At first it had been just her, a widow and outsider, quietly piecing together the horror she had uncovered. But as the days passed, the walls seemed to close in around her. and the very town that had once welcomed her began to turn its back. Father Elias was not the man he appeared to be. Jane had uncovered enough now to know that his intentions were far more sinister than the comforting facade he wore so well. Yet every time she tried to speak the truth, to confront him, she found herself standing alone. The townspeople no longer looked at her with the same warmth they once had. They looked at her with suspicion, with pity, as though she were the one who had lost her way. The fear in their eyes was palpable, a fear that ran deeper than any simple gossip or town rumor. It was the kind of fear that held them captive, that made them afraid to question Father Elias, the man they all believed was sent by God. It didn't take long before Father Elias began to target Jane directly, as though he knew the threat she posed. His visits became more frequent, his presence more imposing. He would appear at her doorstep, unannounced, always at the most inconvenient times. He spoke kindly, almost soothingly, but Jane could hear the underlying threat in his words, the warning that her suspicions were not only dangerous to her but to everyone around her. "You mustn't let these thoughts consume you, Jane," he would say, his voice calm and laced with an eerie gentleness. "You are a good woman, but the path you're on now is a treacherous one. God's judgment is not for us to understand, but we must trust that His will is just. The town is being saved, Jane. It is only through sacrifice that we can achieve salvation." Each word he spoke was a tightening of the noose around her neck, each smile a veiled promise of ruin. Jane began to feel as though she were walking through a dream, a nightmare where the lines between reality and fear blurred with each passing day. The townspeople's distance from her grew, and the more she tried to speak out, the more they recoiled. They had all bought into Father Elias's rhetoric, his talk of atonement and divine retribution. His influence over them had been too thorough, too deep, for them to ever question his actions, let alone believe the truth she was desperately trying to uncover. Father Elias's manipulation of the town's fear was subtle but powerful. He used their reverence for God to justify every terrible thing he did. When the first death occurred, the death of an elderly woman who had begun to question him, the town was quick to dismiss it as the will of God. Her passing was marked as a divine cleansing, a necessary sacrifice to save the community. The town murmured in agreement, their faith growing even stronger. They were convinced that Father Elias's actions were part of a greater plan, one they couldn't possibly hope to understand, but were supposed to trust. Jane could no longer rely on the townspeople. The more she spoke, the more they withdrew from her, as if her words were an infection they feared might touch them. It wasn't just her reputation that was at risk anymore. It was her safety. She had become a target. When Father Elias's gaze lingered on her, she saw something new in his eyes. Disdain, contempt. She was no longer just a woman who had suspicions. She was an obstacle, one that needed to be removed. She had no allies now. Her friends had turned into strangers, their faces masked with fear. Even the most well-meaning had distanced themselves, afraid of being caught in the web of suspicion she had tangled herself in. Every door she knocked on, every ear she tried to bend, only pushed her further into isolation. The only company she had left was the journal she had kept, a silent testament to everything she had uncovered. But it was not enough. The journal could not stop Father Elias's influence from spreading, from choking the town. The pressure mounted with each passing day. Jane felt as if the weight of the truth was becoming unbearable. She knew what Father Elias was capable of. She had seen it in the eyes of those who had fallen under his spell, in the lifeless bodies of those he had saved. The ritual, the torture, the deaths, they weren't accidents or misunderstandings. They were deliberate. He was cleansing them, purging them. And now Jane was the next target. She walked through the streets of St. Agnes as a ghost, a woman trapped in her own town, her own life, with nowhere to turn. The air around her seemed to grow heavier with each breath, and the more she tried to expose Father Elias, the tighter the noose became. The truth she had once been sure of now felt like a sinking weight, pulling her deeper into the darkness. The horror was real, but so was the isolation. It was only a matter of time before Father Elias would make his move, and Jane knew that she would face it alone. The pressure was mounting, the fear in the town undeniable, and Jane could feel herself slipping, her grip on the truth slipping away. What if she was too late? What if no one would believe her? What if Father Elias had already won? The town of St. Agnes seemed to hold its breath as the air thickened with anticipation. Father Elias had grown quieter over the past few days, his usual calm demeanor turning cold, almost detached. There was a heaviness in the silence, a prelude to something Jane could not fully understand but felt in her bones. Her investigation had led her to one undeniable conclusion. The rituals had escalated, and Father Elias was preparing for something far more devastating than anything she had witnessed so far. It was when she overheard a hushed conversation between two parishioners that the truth finally clicked into place. They spoke in whispers, their voices trembling with fear. Yet there was a strange reverence in their words, as if they were discussing a blessed event. Jane had been following Father Elias through the streets one evening, the weight of her suspicions pressing down on her when she overheard them mention the final sacrifice. They spoke of a child, a young boy who had recently joined the parish. The last of the orphans Father Elias had taken under his wing. They said the child was to be purified in a way that no one else had been, a divine cleansing that would cleanse the town once and for all. Her heart raced as she followed their words, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. Father Elias wasn't just cleansing souls. He was planning something far more ritualistic, far more horrific. The child wasn't to be saved. He was to be offered, sacrificed in some twisted version of baptism that Father Elias believed would rid the town of its sins, of its imperfections. He thought he was doing God's work. He believed this final act would grant him salvation, that he would be absolved for everything he had done in the name of purification. With the realization sinking in, Jane's steps quickened, her mind running wild with fear and anger. She had to stop this. She had to save that child. She had to stop Father Elias before he could complete the ritual. As she reached the church, the door was ajar, a faint light flickering inside. She could hear chanting, soft at first, then growing louder as she crept closer. The sound of it twisted her stomach as though the very air around her was charged with malevolent energy. She pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, her breath shallow and quick. What she saw made her heart stutter in her chest. There, in the center of the church, beneath the high altar, lay the child. Strapped to a stone slab, his tiny body trembling with fear. His wide, innocent eyes darted around, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Father Elias stood over him, his hands raised high, his face twisted in a rapture that sent chills down Jane's spine. The townspeople were gathered in a half-circle, standing as if in trance, their eyes glazed over, watching the proceedings with an eerie calmness. They weren't witnesses. They were followers. Father Elias's voice rose in an incantation, one Jane didn't understand, a string of words that echoed through the church with a dark power that seemed to bend the very air around them. His hands moved with practiced precision as he reached for a small ceremonial knife, its blade gleaming in the candlelight. Jane's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure how much longer she could remain hidden. Desperation surged within her. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let the child die. Her legs carried her forward before she could think, a raw, primal instinct pushing her through the shadows. She didn't care who saw her. She didn't care about the consequences anymore. She had to stop Father Elias. "Father Elias!" she cried out, her voice hoarse and breaking as she rushed into the circle, the congregation turning to stare at her with blank, emotionless faces. Father Elias's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. His smile was slow, deliberate, a sickening calm that only made Jane's blood run colder. "You shouldn't have come, Jane," he said, his voice soft, almost pitying. "The cleansing must be completed. It is the will of God." "No," Jane pleaded, stepping closer. "This isn't purification, this is murder. You are killing him. Stop this, please." Father Elias didn't even flinch. Instead, he reached out to the child, gently brushing a lock of hair from his face. "The sin must be cleansed," he murmured almost to himself. "This is the final act, the last sacrifice. Once he is gone, all will be forgiven. All will be well." The child's whimpers were like a dagger to Jane's heart, but she couldn't look away. She had to act. But as she took another step forward, she froze, her gaze falling to the altar behind Father Elias. There in the shadows she saw it. Another altar, another slab. And she realized with sudden horror that Father Elias had not only prepared for the child's sacrifice, he had prepared for hers as well. The realization hit her like a blow. She wasn't just stopping a ritual, she was the final offering. Father Elias had planned it all. He had prepared a place for her, for the one person who stood in his way, the one person who had seen through his lies. She wasn't just a witness to his crimes, she was the last piece, the final soul he needed to claim to complete his twisted version of salvation. "Father Elias," Jane whispered, her voice trembling now with the weight of her fear. "You won't get away with this. You can't." But Father Elias only smiled, his grip on the knife tightening. "I already have," he said, his voice low and cold. "And now, so have you." With a cry of pure terror, Jane lunged forward, grabbing at the nearest object she could find, a small brass candle holder, and struck it against Father Elias's head. The blow sent him staggering back, his grip on the knife faltering for a moment, but it was enough. As he fell, the knife clattered to the floor. Jane rushed to the child, cutting the ropes that bound him, pulling him into her arms. But even as she freed him, the church seemed to grow darker, colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Father Elias wasn't done. Not yet. Jane's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew one thing now. She was out of time. The church was shrouded in a heavy, oppressive silence after Father Elias fell to the floor, his body crumpled and unmoving. Jane held the child in her arms, his small body shaking with fear but still alive. The altar was quiet now, the faint hum of Father Elias's incantation gone, replaced by the sharp rasp of Jane's breathing, each inhaling a fragile victory. She hadn't killed him, but she had stopped him, for now. The ritual was over, but as Jane rushed to the door, pulling the child along with her, the oppressive weight of the church seemed to press harder. The air itself felt thick, as if the walls were trying to keep her inside. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what she had learned about Father Elias. She had stopped the ritual, but she hadn't yet stopped the evil that had brought her here. The town, the whole of St. Agnes one, was still blind to the truth. She had been the one to see the cracks, the one to realize what Father Elias was capable of. But now, she needed to know why. Why had he done this? Why had he subjected so many to his madness? Her fingers trembling, Jane pulled open the drawer where Father Elias kept his journals, the ones she had seen only in fleeting glances, the ones that held the twisted truths she had yet to fully uncover. She opened the first one, the pages yellowed with age, the ink faded in places but still legible. As her eyes skimmed the words, a sickening sense of realization washed over her. Father Elias had not come to St. Agnes out of divine inspiration. He had come because he believed in something far darker. He had been a member of a clandestine order, an ancient and secretive group that believed true salvation could only be achieved through blood sacrifice. The order had been buried, its teachings suppressed, but Father Elias had found it and embraced it. He had seen suffering as a means to an end, as a way to rid the soul of its impurities. And now, he believed that the ultimate sacrifice would bring about an era of purity for the town. As Jane read on, her stomach turned. The massacre of the 22 parishioners had not been random. It was part of the ritual. Father Elias had chosen them, each one representing a different sin, a different flaw in the town's spirit. They had been carefully selected, offered to the altar in a twisted form of redemption. Each death, each sacrifice was meant to purify not just the town, but Father Elias himself, to cleanse him of his own dark beliefs. But the price had been too high. Her hands shook as she turned the page, her eyes searching for the last entry. There, scrawled in frantic handwriting, was his confession. "I must do this," it read. "Only through the shedding of blood will I find peace. I will be the instrument of God's will, and if I must die in the process, then so be it." The horror of it all hit Jane with full force. Father Elias had not seen himself as a monster. He had seen himself as a martyr, a man carrying out the divine will, even if it meant destroying those around him. His belief had become his reality, and it had cost so many lives. The truth left her hollow. She had stopped him, but the cost was too high. The child she had saved was still trembling in her arms, but there was no celebration. There was only a sense of emptiness, of a town that would never know the full extent of the evil that had plagued it. Jane's victory was hollow. She had stopped the ritual, but Father Elias had already sealed his own fate. His madness would never leave him. Suddenly Jane heard a sound, a low, guttering breath behind her. She turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. Father Elias was still alive, barely, his eyes flickering open. His gaze was wild, his breath shallow and uneven. But there was a smile on his face, a smile that made Jane's blood run cold. "You think you've won," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet sharp with a madness that made her skin crawl. "But you haven't. The town is already lost. The seeds have been planted. No one can escape what's coming." Jane's heart pounded as she backed away, holding the child close. She had to get out of the church. She had to leave this place, this cursed town, before the madness swallowed them both. But as she reached the door, she realized with a heavy heart that Father Elias was right. The town had already been touched by the evil he had planted. His legacy was too strong to be erased by a single act of defiance. Father Elias's body lay still now, his last breath a rasping echo in the darkness. Jane could hear the distant murmurs of the townspeople gathering outside, their oblivious voices floating on the air, unaware of what had just transpired inside. They would never know the truth. Father Elias had buried it too deep, and Jane was left with the weight of it all. The blood, the ashes, the lives lost. She turned her back on the church, on the town, and walked into the night, her footsteps heavy with the sorrow of a victory that felt like defeat. The truth was still buried, hidden beneath layers of belief and fear, and she could never unsee what she had learned. As she walked away, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for salvation, but for peace, a peace she knew would never come. The town would carry on, its sins forgotten, its people unaware, and Father Elias would remain a shadow, a lingering presence in the dark corners of St. Agnes, forever sealed in the madness of his own making. The town of St. Agnes was never the same after Father Elias fell. The very air had shifted, as though something dark had been torn from the earth. only to leave behind a deep, festering wound. Jane thought that with his exposure the truth would finally come to light, that the town would rise from the ashes of his influence, ready to face the horrors he had inflicted upon them. But that was not how things unfolded. The first shock came when Jane tried to take her findings to the authorities. She had compiled everything: the journals, the witness accounts, the bodies she had uncovered, the children she had saved. She thought that surely anyone would listen. But as she walked into the small, dimly lit office of Sheriff Jameson, her heart sank as she realized the depth of the town's denial. Sheriff Jameson, a man whose father had been one of Father Elias' most fervent followers, simply looked at her with pity. He listened, or so it seemed, as she recounted every chilling detail. But by the time she had finished, his eyes were already distant. His hands were folded calmly in front of him, and his voice was soft when he spoke. "Jane," he said, his tone almost fatherly, "I understand that you've been through a lot. But what you're saying, it's not something we can just throw into the light like that. Father Elias did a lot of good for this town. A lot of good things happened." His eyes held no sympathy, no recognition of the madness she had witnessed. "Perhaps you're just upset. Perhaps you're just confused." Confused? Jane's blood boiled at the word. She had seen the truth. She had felt it in her very bones, and yet all she received was dismissal. As if her words were the ramblings of a woman driven mad by grief. Sheriff Jameson's indifference was not the only obstacle. The bishop, too, refused to acknowledge the true extent of Father Elias's crimes. When Jane traveled to the diocesan headquarters, she was met with cold silence. The bishop, a thin man with eyes that seemed to flicker with discomfort whenever she spoke, simply nodded along as Jane recounted what had happened. "You must understand, my child," the bishop had said, his voice trembling ever so slightly. "Father Elias was a man of God, a man who worked tirelessly for his community. What you are describing is difficult to comprehend. Perhaps it's best if we move forward as we always have. Perhaps some things are better left forgotten." Forgotten? The word echoed in Jane's mind as if it were a curse. Forgotten. That was what the town wanted. It was as if the suffering of those 22 souls, the lives that had been extinguished by Father Elias's hands, had never existed. The bishop's dismissal, his calm refusal to even entertain the thought that Father Elias had done anything wrong, was the final blow. Jane was left with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal as the town's history was rewritten to protect its false image of piety. But Jane could not, would not, let it go. She continued to speak out even though it felt like her voice was swallowed by the silence that surrounded her. She approached the town council demanding an investigation, but was met with polite smiles and promises of a thorough review. There were no actions, no accountability. The town would not look at the horrors Father Elias had committed, not in the light of day. It was too painful, too disruptive. They wanted peace, even if it meant burying the truth. There were small changes, of course. The town, in the face of Jane's tireless efforts, did begin to pass laws concerning child protection. Medical ethics were reviewed. There were faint stirrings of a shift, a whisper of change in the air. But these laws were not born from the pain of the past. They were born out of fear of what might come to light, a response to Jane's accusations and nothing more. The memory of Father Elias's rituals remained buried, locked in the vaults of silence. The truth was buried with him, and so were the lives of those he had destroyed. It became clear to Jane that the town would never fully acknowledge what Father Elias had done. No matter how much she tried to scream the truth, it would never be heard. No matter how much she pushed, the walls of denial would remain firm and unyielding. She had fought, she had exposed, but in the end, she was left alone, carrying the burden of the town's guilt on her shoulders. She walked the streets now like a ghost, the whispers of the townspeople following her as they always had. Only now there was something darker in their eyes. They feared her. They feared what she knew, and they feared the truth she carried. She had been the one who uncovered it, but they had buried it deep enough that no one would speak of it again. In the silence, Jane felt the weight of the injustice. She had seen the truth, but the town had turned away from it. The memories of Father Elias's rituals, of the blood and the ashes, would never fade for her. They would haunt her for the rest of her life. But the world would forget. The town would forget, and so Jane was left with only one thing, the bitter realization that silence had won. It had swallowed the truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. Years passed, and the town of St. Agnes began to rebuild, but Father Elias's shadow lingered, casting a cold, persistent gloom over everything. The streets filled again with the hum of everyday life. The bakery resumed its scent of fresh bread, children returned to school, and the church bells rang as they always had. But something was missing. Something was wrong. The people moved on, as people always do, pretending to forget the horrors that had been revealed. But the town couldn't erase the truth. No matter how many years went by, Father Elias' evil had left an indelible mark on the fabric of their community. They had erected a memorial, a stone plaque in the center of town, engraved with the words, "In memory of the 22 lost souls who gave their lives for the town's salvation." It was clean, simple, and silent in its ambiguity. The plaque did not mention how they had died, nor did it acknowledge the true cause of their deaths. It was just a token, an attempt to memorialize what the town could not bear to confront. Jane, now older and weary, still carried the weight of the truth. She could never forget what Father Elias had done. No matter how much the town tried to move on, no matter how much they wished to bury the past, Jane couldn't do the same. It haunted her every day. Her hair had grayed, and her shoulders had grown hunched with the weight of the years. But the trauma had never faded. It never would. One evening, Jane found herself standing at the edge of the old graveyard, her eyes tracing the overgrown earth where Father Elias' victims had been buried. The town had done its best to forget, to sweep it all away, but she could never escape the memory of what had happened here. The graves, though long forgotten, were still there, unmarked. Hidden beneath weeds and grass, the remains of the 22 souls lay undisturbed, as if the earth itself had chosen to bury the truth along with them. Her heart ached as she walked slowly through the graveyard, her fingers brushing against the cool stones, feeling the ghosts of the past beneath her touch. The graves were still in a circle, the pattern Father Elias had orchestrated to satisfy his twisted beliefs. His victims were laid out with deliberate intent, arranged for his ritualistic needs. They were nameless, faceless. No one in the town knew their names anymore. They had been forgotten, sacrificed in the name of a false salvation. Jane sank to her knees, the weight of the years pressing down on her. The air was cold, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the lingering scent of decay. The memorial in the town square meant nothing. It was just a hollow gesture, an attempt to erase the truth. The 22 souls were still here, lost to the silence of the town's collective amnesia. Father Elias had been buried with them, his sins locked away in the dark corners of history. And now, the town was content to let it stay that way. The truth had been buried, but Jane could never unsee it. She would never forget. And as she rose from the graveyard, she knew that the evil that had touched St. Agnes would never be truly erased. It had stained the land, the very history of the town, and no memorial, no matter how grand, could change that. The mark of Father Elias' madness would remain forever, hidden beneath the town's fragile illusion of peace. Decades passed, and the town of St. Servan Agnes seemed to have moved on, leaving the shadows of Father Elias' crimes buried beneath the weight of time. The memorial, though a hollow gesture, stood untouched, its words forever etched in stone, but the truth had long been forgotten by most. The town had settled into a comfortable silence, and the memory of those lost to Father Elias's madness faded from collective memory. Yet Jane's journal, the one she had kept hidden, the one filled with the horrors she had uncovered, was never truly gone. It was discovered by accident, buried among old town records, forgotten in the dust of years. No one knew how it had survived, but when it was found, it became a quiet bombshell. Jane's meticulous account of the atrocities Father Elias had committed, the rituals, the sacrifices, the lives stolen, was laid bare for the first time in decades. The diary detailed everything: the horrors Father Elias had inflicted on the children, the town's ignorance, the betrayal of trust, and Jane's desperate attempts to stop him. The revelation came as a shock to those who had never known the full extent of the truth. Some were horrified, some appalled, while others simply shrugged, unwilling to revisit the darkness of the past. The town's reaction was muted, tepid at best. Decades had passed, and the world had moved on. People had found peace in their own way. Society had changed. Laws had been passed, and the memories of the past had been smoothed over with time. Jane, though long gone, was now recognized in a small, quiet way. Her struggle, her sacrifice was no longer dismissed. She was seen as the lone voice that had fought to expose the truth, the one person who had dared to challenge the dark forces that had held the town in its grip. Her courage, though too late to save the victims or halt the rituals, was finally acknowledged. But it was hollow recognition. Too little, too late. As the years went by, the town slowly began to adjust its narrative. The truth of Father Elias's crimes was included in the history books, but it was tucked away, a dark chapter that no one truly wished to revisit. The people of St. Agnes continued their lives now with the knowledge of the past lurking behind them. But they had long since moved forward, leaving Jane's struggle to gather dust once more. The town had tried to forget, and in many ways it had succeeded. But the cost of this amnesia was a quiet erosion of trust, a sense of loss that lingered like a scar beneath the surface. The system that had allowed Father Elias to act with impunity remained largely unchallenged. The town had closed ranks, and despite the passage of time, the evil that had taken root in their midst was still there, buried, forgotten, but never fully erased. Jane's fight had been for truth, for justice, but in the end, the truth was left to rot in the past, buried under the weight of a society that preferred silence over confrontation. The town had shaped its future by burying the past, and in doing so, it had ensured that the legacy of Father Elias and the evil he had sown would never truly fade. The past shaped the future, but in the silence nothing changed. In the end, the horrors of Father Elias's actions are not so easily erased. The memorial, with its sterile words and hollow promises of remembrance, serves as little more than a veneer. Beneath it, the scars of the past remain, etched into the very bones of St. Agnes. The laws have changed, certainly. They had to after the truth came out. Child protection laws were revised, medical ethics scrutinized, and a vague sense of order returned. But none of it could undo the damage done, not to the victims and not to the town itself. The real evil of Father Elias's reign had never been in the rituals themselves. It had been in silence, the quiet complicity of those who allowed him to carry out his madness without question. The institutions that were meant to protect The church, the town's leaders, the very systems in place to ensure justice had failed. They had turned their eyes away, and when faced with the truth, they had buried it. Father Elias's legacy wasn't found in the bodies he left behind. It was in the way those in power shielded themselves, hiding the real nature of his cruelty behind layers of denial and false narratives. The scars that linger in St. Agnes are not just in the forgotten graves or the ignored truths. They are in the very silence that followed the exposure of Father Elias's deeds. The people moved on, their lives resumed, and the town carried on as though nothing had truly changed. But in that silence, the evil persisted. It was not buried in the graves, nor was it wiped clean by the laws that followed. It lay in the quiet complacency of the town, in the inability to confront the ugliness that had been allowed to fester in plain sight for so long. The real tragedy of St. Agnes was not the terror Father Elias had inflicted. It was that the town had learned nothing from it. They had buried the truth and allowed the past to fade into the distance, so that when the next wave of evil came, it would be just as easy to ignore. The systems in place had been reshaped, but the power structures that enabled Father Elias to act with impunity had not been challenged. The mechanisms of silence were still intact, ready to cover up the next crime, the next monster who came in the guise of a savior. As Jane had always feared, nothing had truly changed. The truth was swallowed up by the very forces that had allowed Father Elias to thrive. The people of St. Agnes moved forward, but in their hearts they knew. They knew that the silence was as dangerous as the cruelty itself. And as the years passed, Jane's voice, the voice that had tried to wake them from their slumber, faded, a ghost in the wind. Her struggle now a part of the town's forgotten history. But perhaps that was the most haunting thing of all. What had happened could happen again. And the question lingered, unspoken but felt by all. Could this happen again? The past had taught them nothing, and so the cycle remained hidden in plain sight.